does this from time to time.
Oh, there it goes. It's popped up. Well, yeah, there it goes. It's on now.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. It kind of acts up. All right.
I feel like on Sunday.
So I fixed whatever Susan did to it Sunday, I guess. No, it's not her fault. So again, we're going to move on to week 4 of William Paley's Evidences of Christianity. Again, this book was written in 1794. It is a bit of a difficult read. You have to really focus on it while you're reading it. So you were not going to read it verbatim in the class. We're just basically we've developed a series of studies based on the book, the contents of the book, the thrust of the arguments and evidences that are contained therein. So tonight we're going to start on the week 4. This is the resurrection evidence. So we're going to transition from witness testimony to historical facts. So we're about halfway through the series, and we've built a strong foundation, I would say. Week 1, we established that faith and evidence are not enemies. The Bible actually commands us to give reasons for our hope, and that Christianity stands or falls on historical facts. Week 2, we examined the transformation of the apostles. We saw men who were cowards hiding behind locked doors, who became bold preachers. We saw Thomas the skeptic becoming a worshiper. We saw 500 people who claimed to see Jesus alive at once. And week 3, last week, we looked at what Christianity's enemies said. We read Tacitus's account of Christians being burned alive as human torches. We read Pliny's letter about Christians who could escape by denying Christ, but they refused to do so because they knew the truth. They wouldn't deny the truth. We saw hostile witnesses confirming the very facts Christians claimed. So we've established that the apostles believed they saw Jesus alive and they were willing to die for that testimony. Even their enemies confirmed the persecution. But now we need to ask, what actually happened? What are the historical facts that everyone, believers and skeptics alike, can agree on? And what's the best explanation for those facts? Tonight and next week, we will examine the resurrection itself. This week, we'll establish the facts, and next week, we'll examine the various explanations and see which one makes the most sense. I say this optimistically because you know that I am prone to going over, so it might be the next 3 weeks, but we'll see. I've been pretty good so far. So this is where Paley's approach really shines. He doesn't just quote the Bible and say, believe it. Trust me, bro. I like that phrase. I'm going to use it. He marshals historic evidence, applies reason and logic, and shows that the resurrection is the most rational explanation of the facts. So let's look at what we can establish historically. The minimal facts approach. So before we dive into the specific facts, let's explain the methodology that we're using. It's called the minimal facts approach, and it's used by historians and scholars across the spectrum, believers, skeptics, and agnostics. So here's how it works. We only use facts that meet 3 criteria. Criteria number 1, multiple attestation. The fact must be reported by multiple independent sources. We're not relying on just one gospel or one writer. If something is reported by Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, even non-Christian sources, that's strong attestation. Criterion number 2, scholarly consensus. The fact must be accepted by the vast majority of scholars who study this period of time, even skeptical scholars. We're not cherry-picking evidence. If even people who don't believe in the resurrection accept a certain fact, then that fact is on solid ground. And criteria number 3, historical methods. The fact must be establishable using standard historical methods. We're not assuming the Bible is inspired or inerrant. We're just treating it like any other ancient document, applying the same criteria we'd use for Josephus or Tacitus. So here's what's important. For tonight's lesson, we're not assuming the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Of course, it is. But that's not the point tonight. Tonight, we're simply treating the New Testament documents as historical sources, the way we treat any ancient historical text. And what we find is remarkable. Even using this conservative, skeptical approach, certain facts are undeniable. It's kind of funny to use that word conservative, a conservative, skeptical approach, right? It's rather ironic. Let me show you what I mean. Fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate around AD 30. This is as certain as ancient history gets. So let's see why. There's biblical attestation. All four Gospels report it. Paul mentions it repeatedly. 1 Corinthians 15:3, Galatians 3:1, Philippians 2:8. The crucifixion is woven throughout the entire New Testament. Non-Christian sources confirm it. That's our second criteria. Remember Tacitus from last week. He wrote, Christus, right, corruption, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. That's a Roman historian writing 80 years later confirming Jesus was executed by Pilate. Josephus, the Jewish historian, also mentions it. Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified. Okay? And then our third criteria, scholarly consensus. According to surveys of historical Jesus scholarship, virtually 100% of scholars, including skeptics, agnostics, and atheists, accept that Jesus died by crucifixion. John Dominic Crossan, a liberal scholar who doubts most of the Gospels, calls the crucifixion as sure as anything historical can ever be. So one of the biggest skeptics, critics, agrees that this is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Why such certainty? Because the sources are too strong, too early, too diverse. You'd have to reject virtually everything we know about ancient history to deny the crucifixion. Now, some people have suggested that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he merely swooned, passed out, appeared dead, and then revived in the cool tomb. It's the swoon theory, right? We've heard that before. But of course, this theory is medically absurd. Here's why. First, Roman executioners were professionals at killing people. They had lots and lots of experience, right? Crucifixion was one of Rome's primary methods of execution. They knew how to verify death. They'd been doing it for decades. Second, Pilate himself verified Jesus was dead before releasing the body to Joseph of Arimathea. Mark 15:44-45 tells us Pilate was surprised Jesus died so quickly, so he asked the centurion to confirm it, and the centurion did, and you recall that. Third, the Gospel of John reports that a Roman soldier thrust a spear into Jesus' side, and blood and water came out, John 19:34. Modern medical analysis suggests that this indicates death likely from cardiac rupture or fluid buildup around the heart and lungs. Fourth, Jesus was wrapped in burial spices and laid in a tomb. The Jews who buried him, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, would have known if he was alive. They wouldn't bury a living person. And fifth, even if, impossibly, Jesus had survived the crucifixion, what then? He'd be in a sealed tomb, wrapped head to foot in burial cloths, having lost massive amounts of blood, with broken legs or feet, pierced by nails. How could he escape? How would he roll away a massive stone from the inside? How would he overpower guards? Now, I will say the broken leg thing I would take issue with. So let me just stop you right there. How would he roll away a massive stone from the inside? How would he overpower guards? How would he walk miles on crucified feet? And even if somehow did all that, would his appearance, beaten, bleeding, and limping, convince the disciples he had conquered death? Would that inspire them to preach resurrection? Of course not. The swoon theory creates more problems than it solves. The simplest explanation: Jesus died. The Romans knew how to kill people, and they killed Jesus. Fact number 2. Jesus was buried in a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. All 4 Gospels report this: Mark 15, 42 through 46, Matthew 27, 57 through 60, Luke 23, 50 through 53, John 19, 38 through 42. They all name Joseph specifically. Now, why is this significant? Because Joseph of Arimathea is an embarrassing detail. Look at who Joseph was. According to the Gospels, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council that condemned Jesus to death. He was part of the group that wanted Jesus dead. So think about how embarrassing that is. If you're making up the story, you don't say, oh, and by the way, a member of the council that condemned Jesus is the one who buried him. That makes your story look bad. It raises questions. Wait, one of Jesus' enemies buried him? Why would he do that? Was he secretly a sympathizer? Why didn't the other disciples bury him? But the gospel writers report it anyway. And why? Because it happened. That's what happened. They're not crafting a convenient narrative. They're reporting events even when those events are inconvenient or embarrassing. And there's more. Joseph wasn't just any member of the Sanhedrin. He was a wealthy, prominent man. Luke specifically says he was looking for the kingdom of God, Luke 23:51. He was known in Jerusalem. The gospel writers name him. That means their readers could verify the story. If Joseph of Arimathea never existed, or if he never provided a tomb, someone in Jerusalem would know. The claim would be easily fact-checked. So it's not just some no-name person. It's not just, oh, and they found a tomb, conveniently, sure. No, I mean, this is a fact that can be checked, that would have been known. You don't make up lies about people that are easily fact-checked. Fact number 3. And by the way, that's why that detail about the tomb matters so much, because it leads us to this fact that on the third fact was on the Sunday morning after Jesus' crucifixion, his tomb was found empty. Now, this fact is slightly less universally accepted than the first 2. Some skeptical scholars dispute it, but the majority accept it, and for good reasons. So let's give 4 pieces of evidence. Evidence number 1, women as first witnesses. All 4 Gospels agree that women were the first to discover the empty tomb. Mary Magdalene is mentioned by all 4. Other women are mentioned as well. So why does that matter? Well, because in first century Jewish and Roman culture, women's testimony was not considered legally valid. Women couldn't testify in Jewish courts. Their testimony was viewed as unreliable. So if you're inventing the story, if you're making it up, you'd never have women as your first witnesses, right? If you were just telling this story, you'd say, why, the most reliable person in all of Jerusalem saw him first. You'd have Peter discover the empty tomb, or John, or better yet, multiple male disciples together. That would make your story more credible to your audience. But the Gospels don't do that, because that's what actually happened. They're reporting facts and not crafting propaganda. Think about it from the gospel writer's perspective. They're writing to convince people Jesus rose from the dead. They know women's testimony isn't valued. They know this detail will make skeptics more skeptical, but they include it anyway because historical accuracy matters more than convenience. This is what historians call criterion of embarrassment. When a source includes details that are embarrassing or inconvenient, it's more likely to be accurate. People don't invent embarrassing details about themselves. Evidence number 2, the tomb was in Jerusalem and they preached there. So this is huge. The apostles started preaching the resurrection in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified, just a few weeks after his death. Now imagine you're Peter standing in the temple courts in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and you're proclaiming to thousands of people that Jesus rose from the dead. If the tomb still contained Jesus' body, your message would be destroyed instantly. Someone would just say, "That's nonsense. The body's right there in Joseph's tomb. Go look for yourself." But no one did. No one produced the body. No one said, "I checked the tomb yesterday and he's still there." Why? Because the tomb was empty. Everyone in Jerusalem knew it. Evidence number 3. Even enemies acknowledge the empty tomb. So let's read from Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. This is after the resurrection. The guards at the tomb go back to the chief priests and report what happened. And listen to the chief priest's response. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, 'His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep.'" So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Notice what they don't say. They don't say, "What are you talking about? The body's still in the tomb." They don't deny that the tomb is empty. Why would you bribe people to tell a story? You don't have to pay people to tell the truth like that. I mean, yeah. So instead, they come up with an explanation for why it's empty. His disciples stole the body. That's an admission. They're acknowledging the fact of the empty tomb and trying to explain it away. Now you might say, but Matthew's a Christian, and maybe he's making this up to make the Jews look bad. Okay, fair point. But here's the thing. Matthew is writing this to an audience that included both Christians and Jews in the region. If the Jews had a different story, if they were saying, "We don't know what you're talking about. That tomb was never empty," Matthew couldn't get away with lying about their position. His Jewish readers would call him out. But instead, Matthew reports that the Jews acknowledged the empty tomb and explained it as body theft, and apparently no one disputed that this was indeed the Jewish explanation. And so, evidence number 4, the final piece of evidence, and it's the simplest. If Jesus' body remained in the tomb, the authorities would have produced it. So think about that. The Christian movement is exploding in Jerusalem. Thousands are converting. The apostles are preaching resurrection everywhere. The Jewish leaders hate this. The Romans view it as a potential threat. And they have a dead simple way to stop it all. Go to the tomb, get the body, display it publicly, and say, "Here he is, still dead, stop this nonsense." But they didn't do that. Why not? Because they couldn't. The body wasn't there. And you think about all the run-ins that the disciples had, the apostles had with the authorities. They threw him into jail. They could have just squashed this, but they didn't. They couldn't. And that was the point. They could not squash it. And you really think that somebody could have stolen Jesus' body out of the tomb? No. They weren't going to anyway. These are people that were hiding behind doors. These were people that were like, okay. Denied him. Exactly. They're not going to go steal. What's the point in that? What is the point in going and stealing Christ's body out of the tomb? Okay, so you think about the logistics of that. Let's say that they decide, well, you know what? We don't want to, we don't want all this to come to an end. So it'd either be one of these things where they're like, well, we're going to force it. We're going to go through with it anyway, even though Jesus died and he's there in that tomb. We're going to steal the body. We're going to pretend like he rose from the dead, and we're going to, craft all these. Now, if they'd have gone through with that, if that had been what happened later on when they're being, put to death, when they're being tortured, you think that they would all still claim that the body was not there, that he was resurrected? No, these people were convinced that he was resurrected because they saw the evidence of that. They saw Christ risen, okay? And so what if they decided, what if it wasn't even for an altruistic thing? Maybe it was like, well, we want to save face. Again, stealing Christ's body, well, then what? Why would you go on to preach Christ risen? What are you getting out of this? You're not making money off of it. You're not, it's one of these things where there's really no benefit to them to perpetuate this lie. They're just making trouble. So they're just piling on and piling on and piling on. It's not like one of these faith healers that's making money by fleecing the sheep that come up and, want to get something in return. You're promising people eternal life, right? There's no immediate benefit to that. That is a delayed gratification. And if you don't really think that you're going to get it, then you're not going to continue to endure torture. If somebody promises you millions of dollars if you'll do something, if you know that they're poor, if you know that they're broke, you won't care what they have to say because you know they can't fulfill their promise to you. Anyway.
Yeah, I've heard people try to counter this. What you're saying is excellent, but people try to counter it, but they don't think it all the way through like you just did. They'll say, well, people in history have died for lies, believing lies,
Mm-hmm.
many times. And I can show you examples like that. So, of course they do because they believed it. But people don't die for what they absolutely know. But the guy's poor. They're not going to die for that, like you just said. So, I've always found that ridiculous. They try to pull one over on people.
Exactly.
If they knew that it was a lie, you're not going to die for that.
People will die for a lie if they think it's true.
Yes, if they think it's true.
There are so many people. There are so many people that you see, almost daily. People that are murdering in the name of other religions. They're going to their death. They're blowing themselves up because they think that they're going to be rewarded because they have believed the lie. These people saw the truth and they died because of the truth, not because of a lie they made up. And that's the distinction is if you make something up, everybody gives up at some point, whether you're a kid and you're lying about, where you were, last night, that kind of, at some point, you're going to get caught in that lie and you just can't keep it up. And you just, okay, you're right. I'm sorry. Mea culpa. And there were so many people that would have had to have been in on this conspiracy. Any one of these people could have cracked and told the truth if Jesus hadn't been resurrected, right? But they didn't. Every single one of them. They all were, martyred. They went to their grave, never recanting, right? And they had plenty good reason to do so, being tortured, being jailed. Why is Paul doing what he's doing? If he didn't really have that interaction with the Lord on the road to Damascus, if he didn't really experience those things, why would he do what he did? Why would he endure all the hardship? The same goes for all of those disciples, all those apostles. Like, I would have like, you know what? I don't know what I saw. Maybe I was wrong. I'm just going to go back to being, a well-respected, member of the clergy. I'm going to go back and, live out my days in luxury, being pampered and taken care of and being adored by, my fan club. No. To the bitter end, all kinds of hardships, all kinds of, the thorn in the flesh that he talked about. All of these things, he endured for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but again, we need to be reminded of how absolutely ludicrous our enemies' positions are on these things. They do not make sense. They will say this one thing, right? And they'll slice this little part out and they'll say, well, no, that didn't happen. But their whole position is torn apart by the rest of the picture. They're focusing in on this one little thing and they're saying, well, that didn't happen. But if that didn't happen, then all this other stuff collapses that is provably true, that is historically, factually accurate. And so, sure, you can cherry pick something and just make that claim that didn't happen. But, okay, prove that it didn't happen. Prove it. You have to prove that it didn't happen just as much as I have to prove that it did. And I don't really have to prove anything because it did happen and it's factually there and it's historically, you can test it. But you have to prove that it did not happen. In the face of all this other evidence, you have to prove that what you're saying is true. So, to summarize, women as first witnesses, an embarrassing detail, preaching in Jerusalem where the tomb could be checked, enemies acknowledging the empty tomb, and the absence of any body production, all of this points to one conclusion: the tomb was really empty. All right, so let's move on to fact number 4. So that was evidence number 4. Let's go to fact number 4. The disciples had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, notice how I phrased that. I didn't say Jesus appeared to them. I said they had experiences they believed were appearances. Now, why would we make that distinction? Because even skeptical scholars accept this fact. They may dispute what those experiences were, maybe hallucinations, maybe visions, maybe something else. But they don't dispute that the disciples genuinely believed they saw Jesus alive. Why are scholars so confident about this? Several reasons. First, it's multiply attested. Paul lists resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, written about AD 55, only 20 or 25 years after the events. The Gospels report numerous appearances. These accounts come from multiple sources. Second, the transformation of the disciples, which we examined in week 2, demands an explanation. Something happened that changed them from frightened deserters to bold preachers. What was it? Third, the growth of the early church requires an explanation. Christianity exploded in the first century despite intense persecution. Why? What convinced people to risk their lives for this message? Even Gerd Ludemann, a skeptical German scholar who rejects the resurrection, writes, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. He doesn't believe Jesus actually rose, but he acknowledges the disciples genuinely believe they saw him. Now, here's what's particularly impressive. The appearances weren't just to one or two people. They occurred in multiple categories. To individuals, Mary Magdalene, John 20, 14-17, Peter, 1 Corinthians 15:5, Luke 24:34, James, Jesus' brother, 1 Corinthians 15:7. And not just to individuals, but to small groups, the 12 apostles together multiple times, 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. Is that how you pronounce that? Emmaus, yeah, Emmaus. I know I always mispronounce that. Emmaus, Luke 24:13-35, and 7 disciples by the Sea of Galilee, John 21. And then to a large group. Paul mentioned 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. So, think about that. Paul is writing this about 25 years after the resurrection. He says most of the 500 witnesses are still alive. He's essentially saying, go ask them. They're still around. Interview them yourselves. If he was lying, someone would have called him out, but no one did. So hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, obviously, on multiple different occasions, saw Jesus. I thought they saw, would attest in a court of law that they saw Jesus alive. And then also, not just that, but over an extended period of time. So the appearances didn't just happen once and stop. Acts 1:3 tells us Jesus appeared to the apostles during 40 days, multiple occasions, different locations, different people present. So it's not just one isolated incident that might be explained as a hallucination or a mistake. This is a sustained, repeated, diverse testimony from multiple sources in multiple categories over an extended time period. The fifth and final fact. I like that alliteration. People who had been skeptics or even enemies of Jesus became believers after claiming to see him alive. Two examples stand out. James, Jesus' brother, during Jesus' ministry, his family thought he was crazy. John 7:5 explicitly tells us not even his brothers believed in him. They didn't accept his claims. They were skeptics. But after Jesus' death, something changed. James became a believer. He became a leader of the Jerusalem church. Paul mentions that Jesus appeared to James, 1 Corinthians 15:7, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, records that James was martyred around AD 62, stoned to death by the Jewish authorities. What could convert a skeptical brother into a believing martyr? James said it was seeing Jesus alive, and he was willing to die for that claim. Second example, Paul the persecutor before his conversion. Saul, later called Paul, was hunting down Christians. Literally hunting down Christians. Acts 8:3 says, Saul was ravaging the church, entering house after house. He dragged off men and women, committed them to prison. He was traveling to Damascus to arrest more Christians, when according to his testimony, Jesus appeared to him. And Paul's life was transformed. He went from persecutor to apostle. He endured beatings, imprisonments, shipwrecks, and eventually martyrdom, all for the message that Jesus had risen. You can dismiss one person's conversion as irrational or emotional, but these two represent different categories: a skeptical family member and a hostile enemy. Both converted, both claimed to see Jesus alive, both died for that testimony. And of course, that's not even counting all the people there, at Pentecost. I mean, even in an ancillary manner, these are people that had been, calling for Jesus to be put to death before. Maybe not all of them, but surely some of them. And here they are, being preached the gospel, and they convert. They were pricked in their hearts. All that evidence that Peter lays out for them. And they were witnesses. They may not have been eyewitnesses, but they were contemporary witnesses. They had heard of or knew of these things. And you would think that people would be skeptical and they would check this stuff out. So if there were people in the audience that were converted, you would have heard perhaps of, mass deconversions later, oh, yeah, we believed that stuff, but then we found out Jesus really didn't die. We found his body. There would be evidence to the contrary, right? There would be something that some writer, Josephus or somebody, would have documented that, there was this guy Jesus, and they thought that he had risen from the dead. There was claims about it, but later they found the body, right? You don't think that that would be the case? Of course that would be the case.
Chris, I just wanted to add on top of that.
Yeah.
At Pentecost, obviously, the gift of the Holy Spirit coming in miraculous baptismal measure.
Yes.
Peter being able to perform miracle right in front of them certainly helped their case in believing that day as well.
Yeah, more miracles.
These are Galileans. I better listen. Oh, by the way, that makes good sense. And they saw the fulfilled prophecy of Joel's prophecy with him. He will pour out his spirit upon all flesh. And here it is. The spirit's upon Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw a fulfilled prophecy in real time. So
yes.
That was very receptive.
And you notice that indeed continued. And again, that just gives us, I think that we are very consistent in our view of the Bible and the various things that occurred in the Bible, the miraculous things especially. When Jesus was in his ministry, he performed miracles to prove that he was who he said he was. And then after the resurrection, the apostles carried that on by performing miracles to prove, again, that they were who they claimed to be. And so this was all continued for a time until, enough was documented, until the word was written. It was in this written form, and it could be circulated, and you didn't need that anymore. But there had to be that period of time where there was proof, not just hearsay. And we're not even including that, right? We're not even touching on the miraculous things. These are just historically factual. Again, the premise that we're just reading the Bible as if it's just a historical document, right? And then you pile on top of that the things that were supernatural, right? The miraculous things. And we'll get into that some more too. But again, it's kind of a teaser of, and it puts into perspective too what we're talking about today. This is just this is just the foundation. I mean, this is just the start of it. We're building up even higher. We're building the skyscraper here of truth. Skyscraper of truth. Anyway. All right, so here's the question. So what? What do these facts mean? What do we do with them? Well, first, we need to recognize that these facts demand an explanation. Something happened. Empty tomb, multiple witnesses, transformed disciples, converted skeptics. These are not disputed facts. They're historically established. The question is, what's the explanation? What explains all of these things? Swooning? People having, visions, they having hallucinations? Well, next week, we're going to examine the various explanations that have been proposed. Was the body stolen? Were the appearances hallucinations? Did the legend develop gradually over time? Or did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And we'll evaluate each explanation and see which one accounts for the facts. But for tonight, and we have some questions, and I usually do this. I don't know. I don't really go in for this, but I'll throw them out here. So let's ask some questions. Does this historical evidence strengthen your faith? I mean, I think it does for me, right? Because I'm not just believing something I was taught as a child. I'm not believing something that, I am believing something that has solid historical grounding. Even if I only treat the Bible as ancient history, not as inspired scripture, the facts still point to the resurrection. And I've got to do something with that fact, I've got to make a choice. I choose to believe it, that it was a miraculous thing, or I choose to try and make up some explanation and whistle past the graveyard. Because the ramifications of that are enormous. They are infinite, right? Because if you take this evidence and you choose to relegate it to, it doesn't matter, or there's some excuse and I'm just going to not even think about it, that has ramifications not just in this life, but in the one to come. So we have faith, but it's faith based on evidence, faith based on testimony, faith based on facts that demand an explanation. Christianity is not blind faith. It's based on historical events that are documented, multiply attested, and accepted even by skeptical scholars. So, if these facts are true, if Jesus really did die and rise, what does that mean for how we live? It means death is defeated. It means Jesus is who he claimed to be. It means his teachings carry divine authority. It means we have hope beyond the grave. The apostles lived in light of the resurrection. They gave up everything. They faced persecution. They died as martyrs. Why? Because they knew it was true. They had seen him alive. We haven't seen him with our physical eyes, but we have the evidence. We have the testimony. We have the historical facts. If we're convinced by that evidence, how should we live? With fear, with doubt, or with confidence, joy, and hope? That was a slide I should have had up there. It's a short slide, though. Key takeaways. So, 3 things to take home with you tonight. I'm going to start sounding like a TV preacher. First, these facts are historically certain. Even skeptics accept them. We're not making assumptions. We're not requiring people to just believe. Trust me. I'm sorry. I'll stop. We're presenting facts established through historical methods. Second, embarrassing details prove authentic reporting. Writers don't invent details that make them look bad. They report what actually happened. Third, these facts together demand an explanation. Something happened. Empty tomb, multiple witnesses, transformed lives, converted skeptics. What's the best explanation? So next week, we're going to answer that question. We're going to examine the alternative explanations, the stolen body theory, the hallucination theory, the legend theory, or the truth, the actuality of it, that Christ actually rose from the dead. We'll evaluate each explanation against the facts we've established tonight, and we'll see which one makes the most sense. So we appreciate your attention, and let me hit the button here. Well, I think I can do it remotely. So have a good evening, everyone, as we wrap up.